This individuality, therefore, directs its energies to getting rid of this necessity which contradicts the law of the heart, and also the suffering caused by it. And so it is no longer characterized by the levity of the previous form of self-consciousness, which only wanted the particular pleasure of the individual. On the contrary, it is the earnestness of a high purpose which seeks its pleasure in displaying the excellence of its own nature and in promoting the welfare of mankind. What it realizes is itself the law, and its pleasure is therefore at the same time the universal pleasure of all hearts. To it the two are undivided. Its pleasure is what conforms to the law, and the realization of the law of universal humanity procures for it its own particular pleasure. For within its own self, individuality and the necessary are immediately one. The law is the law of the heart. Individuality is not as yet dislodged from its seat, and the unity of both has not been brought about by the mediating agency of the individuality itself, has not been achieved by discipline. The realization of the immediate undisciplined nature passes for a display of its excellence and as productive of the welfare of humanity. There is so much that is going on here in paragraph 370 that I couldn't put all of it on the board, but I do have the main schema, we could say, for where we're going to put all of this content. And not only is there a lot going on the surface, there is so much that is sort of spills out of this in terms of application to common examples, not only from Hegel's time, but going all the way up to the present in our own time. This is clearly a dialectic that is repeated over and over again throughout the ages. And remember, this is a particularly modern dialectic as well. And I actually want to begin the commentary on this passage, not with the beginning of it, but the very end of it. Why? Because he talks about a kind of naivety that's happening here. And this is important to remember following up from the previous paragraph, 369, where Hegel talked about the person who is trying to live out and actualize the law of the heart as having lost sight of the origin of this particular shape of consciousness. They don't realize that it actually comes out of pleasure. And now Hegel's going to start talking more about pleasure and how it secretly gets itself back in here. So he says, individuality is not as yet dislodged from its seat. This is towards the end. And the unity of both, what is the both here? Individuality and the necessary, has not been brought about by the mediating agency of the individuality itself, has not been achieved by discipline. That is, it has not been achieved by a process in which the individuality works upon itself. It thinks that it can immediately turn to the world and work upon the world and change it for the better in ways that we're going to talk about. It doesn't realize that in order to do that, you require certain discipline. And so, it might be worth meditating on a few examples of this sort of thing. So let's take, the savior in romantic situations, right? Somebody is going to fix the world for suffering humanity, or at least a tiny portion of it, by making this one other person's life better, right? Because they see them and they see that they're kind of a tortured soul, or perhaps they're down on their luck, and they get the short end of the stick even though they deserve better. They're the proverbial diamond in the rough. And, you fall in love with them. We have lots of romantic comedies where this happens, right? You see the person struggling and you see that they're a decent person and you want to help them out, right? And where the romantic comedies will have a little bit, because the character arc is usually interesting encounter, get involved, then there has to be some sort of situation, like you kick a puppy, or you cheat at work, or somebody says something and it's taken in the wrong context, and then they're a bad person. Then they learn from their mistake and they're there with the boombox or the flowers or whatever, right? I mean, there's a million different variations on this same story, right? And then there's a reconciliation at the end, and they're older and wiser but yet happy together, and cut to credits. Well, that's not the way real life works, right? I mean, romantic comedies are imaginary processes. Instead, what often happens is the person launches into this, I'm going to save this other person through my love, right? And what happens is, because there's no discipline on this side, they get in over their heads, and pretty soon they're the one who needs to be saved, or they find themselves unable to follow through on things, and excuses start flying, and pretty soon it all falls apart, right? Another great example would be, I'm going to help the poor because I'm going to show solidarity by living with them. Hey, spend some time in impoverished areas if you're not from those kind of areas, and you'll see why people want to get the hell out of them, quite frankly, fairly quickly. And if you approach that sort of situation and you actually have some discipline, you have developed it through, mental training or some sort of education or something along those lines. Now you actually have something to offer to those people. And that discipline typically extends to things like how you structure your day. It can't just all be sentimentality and wanting to be a helper and wanting to fix things, or you're going to end up foundering. And so Hegel's talking about that here. He says, there hasn't been a mediating agency of the individual itself. It has not been achieved by discipline. So he says the realization of the immediate undisciplined nature. Why are people engaging in this? Now here's where we get to the hidden motives. We have all these, as Hegel says, fine sentiments. What's really going on? He says the realization of the immediate undisciplined nature passes for a display of its excellence and as productive of the welfare of humanity. Isn't it nice how two things can come together? You're helping humanity or the world or the environment or this one person or, animals, or pick whatever you like, right? You're being a helper, you're making things better, every day the world is slightly better because of your efforts, and you get to eat your cake as well, even though you're giving your cake away. I'm mixing some metaphors here, but you get the idea, because you get to feel so good about what a swell person you are for the contribution that you're making. You notice that I've got pleasure here as sort of welling up. And Hegel thinks that's a large part of what is going on in terms of the law of the heart. It's not just that somebody is this absolutely tortured soul and they have to help out because if they don't, they're going to be miserable, but they never get any happiness out of it. No, it makes them feel good, and they can actually get a little addicted to that feeling good and sticking it, pointing in the wrong way, sticking it to the man, sticking it to the power structure, sticking it to the establishment, sticking it to the people who are standing in the way. It doesn't always have to be done in that sort of sense either. It could be sticking it to the warlords, sticking it to the criminals. It could be all sorts of variants of this sort of thing. The patriarchy, the emasculating culture, whatever you like, right? The point is, in this shape of consciousness, the law of the heart is connected with a kind of pleasure. So let's see how this plays out. He says this individuality directs its energies to getting rid of this necessity, which contradicts the law of the heart. What's the necessity? This alien necessity that we talked about in the last place, this unjust, unfair, irrational, whatever we want to say, Ordnung in German, of the real world, of Wirklichkeit, of what is actual, the office that you're in. Why do we do the procedures this way? Why do we have the rules that we have? Why are those people in charge and not people who are, better suited to their jobs or care more about the employees or aren't corrupt or. We can go on and on with that sort of thing. There is something that confronts us as being unfair, unjust, but the way it is. So the law of the heart says, fight that. Get rid of that. Why? Because then you're the good guy or the good girl. You are helping suffering humanity. Now remember from the last paragraph, this is a suffering humanity that can't truly help itself because this alien necessity, the world order, has in a certain sense contaminated it. The person who has the law of the heart is coming in as the white knight, and he or she is going to open up their eyes, raise their class consciousness, woke them, whatever you want to put, right? All of these things are variants on one big theme. Suffering humanity can't take care of itself as individuals because it's been so damaged by the unjust, whatever it happens to be, the world order. So you're going to promote their welfare as self-consciousness. So he says, it's no longer characterized by the levity of the previous form of self-consciousness, which only wanted the particular pleasure of the individual. Once you get past your own pleasure and you say, I don't need to buy myself chocolate bars or go to the bar or dress in nice clothes or have the car or whatever, I don't need to do all of that stuff. I don't need to go to the parties. I have something more valuable to what I'm doing. I'm promoting humanity. I am fixing the world. Well, there's a different kind of pleasure that comes with that. But it is still pleasure, Hegel says, for a lot of people. At this stage, he's not saying that every person who's a philanthropist or doing charitable works or anything like that in the world fits into this, by the way. This is a particular shape of consciousness. But it is one that we can identify in many examples in our own life, perhaps even in ourselves. So he says, this is not the particular pleasure of the individual. On the contrary, it's the earnestness of a high purpose which seeks its pleasure in displaying the excellence of its own nature. So, what's really happening here? In promoting the welfare of humanity, in fighting the power that be, right? It's also getting to tell itself what a great guy it is, or a great gal it is, because it's doing these wonderful things. It has a high purpose. I'm not just, kicking in these doors or, scrawling things or leaving comments on an internet video because I just, like to screw with people or I'm, having some fun or anything like that. I'm doing something real. I'm opposing badness and I'm helping people. That's a high purpose. That's what Hegel's talking about here. That's the law of the heart. So he says, what it realizes is itself the law, and its pleasure, therefore, at the same time, is the universal pleasure of all hearts. Notice what's going on there. There's an exchange of pleasure, at least in an imaginary way, between the individual self-consciousness who is acting in the world according to the law of the heart and the humanity which is being turned essentially into sort of a mirror or a set of props, but still also being hopefully respected as humanity for that allows now this individual to center the universality of all hearts in its individual heart, at least at this stage, at least in its mind. Now, what often happens in cases like this is there is a brutal confrontation with reality, and it usually comes by the suffering humanity actually saying, oh, wow, enough of your nonsense. We don't need your do-gooder attitude here because you don't know what the hell you're doing, and sometimes you're actually making things worse, and you seem to be more interested in your high purpose and how you look than in our actual welfare as we understand it. But that pushback is going to happen later on. Right now, the individual self-consciousness gets to bask in its effectiveness, in its high purpose, in what great things it is doing, how it's promoting humanity. It gets to feel a kind of unity which it's projecting imaginatively. All of that is contained in this paragraph. All of that, I think, is highly relevant not only to understanding human actions from Hegel's time and even before it onward to our own, but in our present. So where do we go from here? That's what we have to see. Is this going to work out or is this going to fall apart? The law, on the other hand, which confronts the law of the heart, is separated from the heart and exists in its own right. Humanity, which is bound by this law, does not live in the blessed unity of the law with the heart, but either lives in their cruel separation and in suffering, or at least dispenses with the enjoyment of itself in obeying the law, and lacks the consciousness of its own excellence in transgressing it. Because that authoritative divine and human ordinance is separated from the heart, it is for the latter a mere show, which ought to lose what is still associated with it, that is, the power of authority and reality. In its content, it may well by chance agree with the law of the heart, and then the latter can submit to it. But for the heart, what is essential is not the bare conformity to law as such, but that in the law it has the consciousness of itself, that therein it has satisfied itself. Where, however, the content of universal necessity does not agree with the heart, then necessity, even as regards its content, is itself nothing and must give way before the law of the heart. Here in paragraph 371, Hegel is deepening and making starker this confrontation between the individual who is motivated by the law of the heart and the cruel, the unfair, however we want to put it, irrational, nepotistic, whatever, world order. But now it's being talked about not just in terms of Ordnung, that is a structure, a way in which things are arranged, but a law, a gazettes. And we have a confrontation between two laws. One which appears to be much more effective, the one that's governing the world and the rest of humanity, than the law of the heart is. Because the law of the heart so far just applies to this particular individual. There is something going on here that gives a sort of impetus or energy to the law of the heart, which is what he's going to talk about in terms of a unity and an associated affective reflection of that in terms of the law of the heart. But he says the law, on the other hand, which confronts the law of the heart, is separated from the heart and exists in its own right. It is an alien necessity, as he's called it. It is a sort of brute factum. You're born into a society. What we see here again is sort of a recapitulation of the old, ethical substance. But now the ethical substance has turned dark and forbidding and mean and unfair, right? The mores, the laws, the customs of your society, the Sitte, right, have turned against the law of the heart, the law that wants to set things right. So he says humanity, which is bound by this law, remember that the person, the self-consciousness that's motivated by the law of the heart, wants to save, wants to benefit, wants to promote the welfare of the rest of these poor suckers in humanity who aren't able to do that for themselves. So he says humanity, which is bound by this law, does not live in the blessed unity of the law with the heart. So there is a unity of the law and the heart in the person who is experiencing this. The rest of humanity doesn't have that. Instead, what they live in, he says, is a cruel separation and suffering. There is a realization on the part of humanity there. They're not totally, out to lunch, right? They're like, yeah, things are screwed up, but nobody has an idea about how to fix it, or the ideas that they have just fit right back into the world order and perpetuate it, right? So he goes on and he says, they live in cruel separation and suffering, or it dispenses with the enjoyment of itself in obeying the law. A law that's worth obeying will actually feel good if the individual is rightly oriented towards it to obey, right? So if we know that, for example, when we're playing games, I'll take a very trivial example, that following the rules makes for a better, more enjoyable game, even if it means that we lose the game and we follow the rules, we feel a kind of satisfaction in that. We call that sportsmanship, right? It's reflected in a virtue. So he says, there's that, or it lacks the consciousness of its own excellence in transgressing it. So when these people do transgress the law of the world order, say through criminality, they may take a certain kind of pleasure. Hey, I'm sticking it to those guys. But it's an individual pleasure. It's not a, hey, I'm like benefiting humanity by transgressing these unjust laws, these unfair social arrangements. I'm actually doing something to promote humanity. There isn't any sense of that. At least that's how it appears for the person over here who is motivated by the law of the heart. So he says, because that authoritative divine and human ordinance is separated from the heart, it is for the law of the heart a mere show, a shine, an appearance, right? It's not the reality of things. It doesn't have real effectiveness to it. That's what emboldens the person of the law of the heart to get in there and start mixing it up. So that person also thinks that the law or the order, the way of the world ought to lose these things that it actually, he says that it has. Authority, Gewalt. The sense of this is not, like legitimate authority. It's like it's what's been imposed. And reality, Wirklichkeit. Its reality ought to be abolished. If there are unfair social arrangements, say that some people don't get to go to school or participate in certain jobs because of one qualification or another, like say the color of their skin. Well, we get rid of that. We make that no longer a reality, or we make it, if it is a reality, just something that's being transgressive and criminal, right? There are, in fact, all sorts of unfair, unjust, unequitable, irrational power structures in societies. And so the law of the heart person is reacting against that. Hegel goes on and he says, here we go, in its content, it may well by chance agree with the law of the heart, and then the latter can submit to it. So sometimes, even in the most unfair society, there will be some things, like there may be a law against stealing, right? So you follow that law, even though by not stealing, you're still supporting the power structure. Well, it's still not stealing. And so you can feel okay about that. But he says, but for the heart, what is essential is not the bare conformity to law as such, but that in the law it has the consciousness of itself. That therein it has satisfied itself. That it can say, yeah, I buy into this. I ratify this. I can legislate this for myself and for all humanity as a reasonable rule. Does that sound like anybody, by the way? Now we're actually starting to get closer to the Kantian kingdom of ends, aren't we? And there's some overtones there. Although, remember, this is in terms of sentiment, not in terms of principle, right? And there were a lot of people trying to push something like that in Hegel's time. We can just get people to feel the right way, and then the right ideas will come forth from that. Today we talk in terms of, hey, if we could just get people to be empathetic. If they were empathetic, then we would naturally understand the plight of the other, and we wouldn't other them, and we wouldn't, let power and principalities and the political system do what it does to them. And Hegel would say, well, we got to be careful with that, you know? Maybe you're putting a little bit too much stock in the power of empathy to deliver something greater than itself, which would be principles, which would be something that could be objective, not just a feeling that you have. Hegel is always going to be telling us that feelings are not by themselves a good guide. So he goes on and he says, where, however, the content of universal necessity does not agree with the heart, then necessity, even as regards its content, is in itself nothing and must give way before the law of the heart. This is in part why the law of the heart and the single individual can have in some cases, world-shaking effectivity, a way of changing things, because they can actually say, I understand that you've got this entire system over here and that it's necessary, but I don't care about your necessity because I have something higher than that I can oppose to it. You think you got necessity? I got real, vital necessity, he might be saying. And so that is what the individual is going to do. This is very powerful. This leads to social transformations at times. But there is also a dynamic that is self-defeating within it that now we're going to explore.